Hello and welcome to this edition of New Humanum. My guest today is Roger Wagner. Roger is a painter, an artist, an illustrator, a poet. He lives and works in Oxford, and much of his work is on a religious theme. Roger Wagner, welcome to New Humanum. To begin at the beginning, tell me about your early life as an artist. Were you someone who always knew from a young age that art was going to be your thing, that you wanted to be a painter?
I certainly drew and loved drawing and painting from an early age. I remember when my grandfather had been a teacher, had his own school. I went there as a very small boy, and I had a teacher who I just met or got in contact with again the other year, who was very glamorous. She became quite a well-known actress, but she was very, very beautiful. And I remember I must have been about 5 or 6. We had to ask for pencils and paint, and I went up to her and said, "Please, miss, may I paint your portrait?" And she was absolutely sweet. She said, "Yes, I'm very good at painting my portrait, and I'll help you." In fact, she's now an artist as well. And that was, I think, the first picture that I remember doing.
So the instinct was always there.
The instinct was certainly there. Yes, I mean, I don't know that I ever thought at that stage of being a painter. I didn't know anyone who was a painter at that. But we certainly had pictures in the house which were which I always sort of loved, and were taken along to sort of galleries and things from a young age. So I was always sort of drawing. I loved doing cartoons, actually. That was my first ambition was to be a cartoonist, I think. But when the actual, and I was certain, I think I even wanted to be a film director. But gradually the desire to paint sort of got sort of stronger, and I certainly by the time I was coming to about to leave school, I'd had the offer to sort of go to an art school, and I would have gone there, but I was directed to. They thought I could get into university and get into Oxford, and I sort of did, and so sort of went to Oxford, but near the end of my time there, I felt so strongly that I wanted to be an artist that I nearly left to go to art school. So it had obviously been sort of growing within me all that time.
Yours was a London childhood, I think, wasn't it? So you were was it Chelsea that you were domiciled in, and of course, being a London child, you are surrounded by fantastic collections of art.
Well, yes, no, absolutely. The sort of National Gallery and the British Museum and the sort of Wallace collection and all these sort of things were, which we would most sort of, certainly if it was raining every Sunday, we would go along to one of these sort of places, or sort of Chiswick or somewhere like that, and see these extraordinary pictures. But I'd had a cousin of my grandfather had been a sort of collector, and he was a bachelor, but went along to, in the 1890s and early 1900s, went along to sort of Sotheby's every day and sort of bought the little, with just very small amounts of money, but he built up this extraordinary collection of Italian primitive paintings, quite a lot of which are now in the National Gallery. But we had still a few. So I was sort of brought up looking at these pictures, and so, which again must have had a sort of huge impact on me.
Yes, I was going to ask you about that, because a child's imagination, if you're surrounded by those sorts of images, they must sort of sink in somehow, and maybe later in life blossom.
Yes, I mean, I suppose you think it's just normal to have a sort of altarpiece on your above your sort of fireplace, or sort of Madonnas and childs of stuck around the house, and so I thought this was just a normal thing that most people had, but didn't. But yes, they clearly had a sort of a sort of big. Well, they kind of were almost below the surface. You don't realise, and until I suppose I was an adolescent when I actually went to Italy and saw these kind of pictures and where they'd come from, and what but it formed the basis of, I suppose, what I thought pictures could do.
So you decided to embark on the life of a painter, and I think that, not knowing much about that world myself, but that's a precarious sort of occupation, and not one which is necessarily going to lead to a very you're not going to make a lot of money at it necessarily initially. So, I mean, but this was just something you felt, I have to do this. Well, am I right in the first instance? I mean, was it precarious, and did you worry about that?
Well, I think the wonderful thing about being young is that you're hugely impractical, and I was very romantic, really, and didn't. So I don't think at that stage I did. And also, I'd read, the letters of Van Gogh and things, but for me, in fact, when I was at Oxford, I was just sort of coming up to my sort of finals, and I had this very sort of strong sense that actually painting was what I was called to do. It was almost like a kind of religious vocation. It was actually, I felt something that God had told me I ought to do. And so I remember one evening when I suddenly had this realization, sort of walking, I was living in digs in Jericho, sort of walking around Jericho at sort of 2 o'clock in the morning, thinking, I've got to go and do this. I knew I could go to art school, but I didn't. I now felt I had to do it straight away, and I sort of remember waking one of my house flatmates up at sort of 3 o'clock in the morning, thinking, I'm leaving. and indeed, I went to see all my tutors and parents, and they were all deeply upset by this. But eventually was directed to the college chaplain, who understood what I was sort of going through, and sort of said that it may well be that God had called me to do this, but probably he didn't want me to sort of throw away 3 years of education just before finals to do it, which I was hugely relieved, actually, because I didn't really want to leave. But so when I did, I didn't feel at that point that I was embarking on a precarious path. I felt that I was doing exactly what I was meant to be doing, and so I felt completely secure. Not that I had any sense that I'd be financially secure, but I wasn't really worried about that at that stage.
That's very interesting. So you felt impelled by some notion, some force outside yourself to become an artist. You liken it to a religious vocation, and that's very much what it sounds like, as if you had a sort of moment of revelation, really. This is what my life is going to be.
Yes, no, it was exactly like that. And I was reading someone, I think William Blake, who was, started life as a printer and had this little printing firm, Parker and Blake, and at some point he felt God saying to him, Blake be an artist and nothing else. And that was very much really what I felt as well. It was, and yes, how it's going to work out, I had no idea. But as I said, I wasn't really worried at that stage.
You were raised in a family where aesthetics were clearly, well, beauty was all around you. You know, that accounts for your formation in a sense, doesn't it, as an adult, perhaps?
It certainly had I mean, I don't think I asked many questions about it. It wasn't something that I sort of interrogated particularly, but I did just receive it, and it's it's that and the sort of the landscape, and because we also had all our sort of holidays in Suffolk, and the sort of Suffolk landscape had an enormous sort of impact on me. It's when you read sort of Wordsworth's description of his sort of fair seed time had my soul, he described it. Well, I think I would say the same, that it was there's a sort of just great sort of richness of sort of beauty and
that reminds me of a remark you made about Constable, actually, because you said that that although Constable's landscapes are not obviously religious in content, being of trees and fields and village landscapes and so on, but nevertheless, I think you quoted him as saying something about the landscape being God's handiwork or something, or that landscape is God's own work, I think is what you said.
Yes, I forget the exact quotation now, but it was, yes, he was. I mean, very much. He saw it like that, and
is that how you see it?
I think there's that wonderful sort of Psalm 19. It talks about the heavens declaring the glory of God. The firmament makes known his word, and it's. But then it goes on to say there is no speech, there are no words, and yet it somehow speaks, and I think that's what I feel about sort of landscape. You can go into a landscape and it can mean nothing to you, yet then suddenly, maybe the sun comes behind a cloud or so, and it's full of sort of meaning. It sort of speaks of sort of glory and wonder, and so it is, as it were. Again, sort of Coleridge talks of it as a sort of language which God speaks to us, but to hear that, you have to kind of let yourself be tuned to it. And it's easy to sort of screen it out or just ignore it. But if we allow ourselves to sort of see it like that, then indeed that is how it is. And that's, I think, we're seeing the truth then. We're not kind of making it up or sort of pasting that kind of interpretation on top of it. We're actually seeing to the heart of things.
This is a sense of awe in the face of creation and its wonders. Yes.
I think awe is and sort of wonder is actually, when you see something with a kind of rounded eye of wonder, you're really seeing it. Otherwise, it's what again Coleridge calls the film of familiarity. It can just sort of screen it out from you, but to actually to wonder at it, to see it with awe is actually to see it.
Yes, yes. I mean, you and I first met some years ago now actually, but because one of your a subject to which you returned often as an artist, as a painter, were the wonderful black poplar trees at Binsey, and along the riverbank there, and yes. Which was also, of course, the subject of Gerald Manley Hopkins' famous poem about the poplars at Binzi. And I wonder if what you're talking about there, about seeing the reality of creation, the awe and the wonder, if that was part of your fascination with those trees in Binzi.
Yes, I mean, I used to, when I was, I said before, when I was an undergraduate, I lived in Jericho, and so I would go out and often and walk underneath the trees there, which had this extraordinary, because they have these long sort of stems for the leaves, so that when the wind blows, you hear this sort of oceanic sort of sound underneath them, and I would often just sort of walk up and down underneath, when I was thinking of an essay or something like that. But they, yes, they did somehow sort of speak to me in that kind of, and it's a strange. I mean, Hopkins's poem was, lamenting the fact that they'd been cut down, and we first thought when they'd been cut down again, but. But actually, that's something. I mean, I have a poem once which talks about cloud formations and how you see this extraordinary cloud. I mean, the poem is all about sort of going for a walk, seeing this extraordinary cloud formation, and then coming back, and it's all gone. Mm-hmm. And the last line of the poem is, "Beauty is the gift of each moment. We kiss our hand to it as it passes." And that is an aspect of beauty. It doesn't, you have to enjoy it when it's there, and you can't repine too much when it disappears, because it does disappear. It isn't a permanent thing.
Yes, although of course your canvases try to make it permanent.
Well, they try and prolong it a bit. I mean, they won't last any more than anything else lasts, but they can sort of focus our attention on it, and maybe it just lasts a little longer than I do.
So I mentioned in my brief introduction that a lot of your work has explicitly religious themes, and of course, in doing that, you are really swimming against the tide of modern art, if you will, in the country, which is yours is niche, but you've found an audience, and you have become actually very notable in the world of religious modern painters. How did that? I mean, was that something that you determined on doing, or was it something which grew out of just your vocation as a painter, and you were naturally led in that direction? Why is your art so infused with these religious themes? Well,
I mean, you're right that I am often sort of referred to as a kind of religious artist and things, but there always seems to be, and I said this before, actually something quite strange about that, in that when you think about it, the connection between art and religion is so ancient and so profound that the kind of all the great civilizations have produced art and religion are essentially the same thing. They're not sort of separate things. Every traditional society that one can think of, that's the case. As far as we can tell, as far back in prehistory as you can go, that's been the case. It's only really in the last 300 years or thing that the two have seemed separate, or seem to go separate ways. So to me, and I think there are interesting sort of reasons for that, but I think essentially there are no non-religious artists. Everyone is actually making images about things that are help to make sense of the world in some way, or even if they don't think that the world makes sense, you can't avoid that sort of basic sort of impulse in art. So I'm in a sense of I'm not, as it were, putting I don't think of it as a kind of niche activity. I think of it as a sort of fundamental activity. But I think of the particular kind of, I suppose, religious or sort of Christian view that I'm putting is, it seems to me, where that comes to its sort of truest version. And so I'm I suppose, wanting not to be apologetic about that and to actually to make it central. And I suppose I sort of quoted Blake earlier, but there's a wonderful in one of his books, which is called Milton, a Prophecy. The introduction to it is actually an appeal to artists, to young artists, and to architects and writers. And he says, don't be conformed to, I'm sort of paraphrasing, to the work of the age, where people are making vast amounts of money from meaningless sort of pictures, but actually found your work on Jesus Christ, and make that the centre of your work. And he then goes into this great poem. And did those feet in ancient times walk upon England? And that's where it comes from. And it's actually an appeal to artists. People kind of misunderstand that poem, but and he ends, I would that all Christ's people were prophets, or all the people of Israel were prophets. And that seems to me the heart of the artistic calling.
You place yourself then in that answer, in an artistic tradition stretching right back through English history. And do you feel that yourself, that you are, are you conscious in any sense of perpetuating this tradition? Is that or it is just you as an artist, and that is natural to you?
Well, I don't think I sort of set out exactly to do that. But what I do, I think someone once said that, art that is worth anything shouldn't just be one person thick. It should be many people thick. And that's the art that I've really responded to in my life, that just has this sense that yes, it's fresh and novel and wonderful because it's an individual who's doing it, but it's also has behind it a great sort of weight of other people who have worked in this tradition and have produced things, and so that one picture has a sort of great depth to it. And that's what I've longed for in my own work, that it should have a kind of a depth and have a sort of resonance that sort of that echoes the things that have been done before, but is also trying to make them new.
I would say one of your canvases where you achieve that triumphantly is the canvas Menorah, which was the first time I became aware of your work. I think it was on display in the Ashmolean because it had won a prize, I think. And I remember standing in front of that picture and receiving from it an emotional and spiritual charge. But for those who don't know it, it's actually the superimposition of a crucifixion scene set against the background of a landmark familiar to anybody who lived in Oxfordshire, which was the Didcot Power Station, and those enormous... Just tell me about the genesis of that picture, because I want to know, actually, how those two things came together.
Well, it started when I was still an undergraduate and used to sort of go up and down to London on the train, and I was just passing Didcot one evening and just saw this this sort of power station. There was a very dramatic sky behind it, and there was this sort of smoke which was streaming out of the chimneys in this very kind of elegiac way. And I had a sort of notebook with me, and I just sort of sketched it down. I just thought this is a really sort of powerful thing. But I came back and I had this sort of drawing, and I was thinking, this is somehow, because it almost looked like an arch behind the thing. It looked like the background of some great religious scene. But what would be in the foreground of this? And I sort of kind of think on paper. I was drawing images, and they actually began to look like figures from the photographs of the Holocaust and sort of things like that. They were contemporary figures, and the first version I did of this, it then turned somehow into a deposition that I had. It was but then, and I did a picture like that, and then someone who'd seen the canvas said, "Did you intend that these should be a menorah?" And I suddenly changed the whole, because they do. There were two groups of 3 tiles on either side and a sort of central chimney in the middle, and it formed exactly the menorah, which was obviously a sort of symbol for the Jews of the presence of God. And so then, when I'd sort of seen that, it then became a crucifixion, because it was the symbol was both, it looked like, because with that central crematorium kind of chimney, it had a sort of very sinister feel of Auschwitz, but then it also looked like a symbol of the presence of God. And so the crucifixion was then obviously, it is, why have you forsaken me? Why, God, it is the most God-forsaken sort of, but then it is also God with us. And so the two things came together, and I was doing it during the time of the sort of Bosnian War, and so there were all these sort of terrible sort of grieving families and things on the newspaper. So they sort of came into the picture as well. And yeah, so that was really the sort of genesis of the painting.
That picture, and many of your other pictures, have this intriguing mix of religious imagery, but set often against industrial scenes. So I have a canvas of yours, which is Abraham and the angels. They're gathered underneath the tree, Abraham and the 3 angels. But in the background there's what looks like a cement works. And that is quite a minatory and threatening thing. It feels as if, it feels in many of your canvases, as if there is a threat. And it comes often through the depiction of industrial buildings and installations. I mean, what is that about?
Well, yes. I mean, it's in fact it's the sizable nuclear power station in the background of your picture, because I as I was saying, I sort of grew. We always had our holidays in Suffolk, and near sort of Sizewell, and I was sort of there when the power station was being built, and I just remember seeing one day this sort of cornfield, the wonderful sort of pastoral scene, and behind it this looming presence of the nuclear power station, which emitted a kind of hum which sort of spread over the fields, which did seem somehow sort of threatening, and it immediately reminded me of the story in Genesis of when the angels come and have a meal with Abraham just before the great cataclysmic destruction of the cities of the plain. So it's a kind of picnic on the edge of doom. And yes, I've always, we talked about sort of beauty, but the problem, with some kind of the beauty can, if it just seems escapist, it can just seem sort of prettiness. It doesn't seem to speak to the reality of, and so I always wanted pictures that combined, that sort of spoke of beauty, but also confronted a world in which seemed to deny any sort of beauty and sort of hope. And I wanted the two things to sort of somehow to go together. So industrial buildings seem, because they're often sort of blank, they don't have windows, they aren't sort of human in that sense, but they are grand and imposing. They kind of seemed a perfect sort of metaphor for that, and because you get them in these kind of sort of landscapes. So yes, so I've kind of used, they've been a sort of continuing metaphor for, and I also actually, they do have their own kind of weird beauty as well.
They do, they do.
So
yes.
Yeah.
No, I see. But do you fear some sort of environmental or ecological catastrophe? Do you? I mean, is that something which haunts your dreams? Are you, or are you content to be in the hands of Providence?
Well, I mean, I think it's very difficult to live in the either the 20th or the 21st century without sensing that, you know, we are on a, you know, doom surrounds us on every side, but on the other hand, it's focusing on, you know, if you just think in terms of what can you do to get out of this, well, I think that's there's no well, I suppose salvation in the end doesn't come from you know, I honour political activists and so on, but I don't in the end think that is where, you know, human salvation sort of comes from. So I've always wanted to have a sort of transcendent aspect to my sort of work, which, yes, we actually have to do things in the world, but, you know, I'm afraid I'm not we all have kind of limited bandwidth, and sort of activism isn't really my
No.
I suppose my calling is to make images, and that's what I sort of try and do.
You make images, certainly, and actually you haven't confined yourself to canvas. There is, not far from here, the parish church at Iffley, where you did a stained glass window, and I know that you have also you have illustrated and produced and published books of psalms, and so you worked actually in spheres other than just pure paint, but always the same themes. Yes. Yes,
I mean, I haven't done that many sort of commissions for churches, but I've.
What was it like doing that stained glass window? Because I mean, that is. I mean, I imagine that the technique of making stained glass is very intricate and specialised, is it not? How did you do that?
Well, I was very fortunate in that I happened to be a friend of Tom Denny, who is the great sort of stained glass maker in Britain at the moment, and he really sort of taught me how to make stained glass, and so I did work quite a bit in his studio, and as well as sort of making it here. But yes, it's an incredibly complicated process.
For those who've not seen it, it's a working of the theme of the tree of life, isn't it? So just explain what it is to me.
Well, it was interesting because the Piper window, which is was installed in the 1980s, is I think one of his best windows. It's a nativity window, which has got the animals. It's based on a medieval painting, but it has at the centre of it a sort of tree of life, so I was asked to do a window to sort of to go with that, and originally I'd thought of doing a a nativity of some kind. But then I thought it would be a good idea to ask the congregation what they felt, and not really anticipating that that I would be guided by this, but it would be but in fact, people came up, and someone suggested they'd seen some of my tree paintings, one of which had a sort of crucifixion in front of it, and says, "Why didn't I do something like this?" And so I just sort of started again, sort of painting, and very quickly this little image arrived, in which was it was a flowering tree with Christ sort of crucified on the tree, and a sort of river of life flowing down from it, was going towards the font, because that was the other thing that I'd been asked to sort of link it with the font as you go into Iffley Church, and sort of sheep on beneath the tree, I was a little worried when I did this, because it seemed to have a sort of poetic images, but it didn't clearly had any immediate sort of scriptural basis. So I did this thing. I went off I happened to be going on holiday to Rome, and while we were there, we went into San Clemente, which is an extraordinary sort of 12th century church, which is built on a sort of 6th century church, is built on a 1st century church, which is all underneath them. But in the apse there is a mosaic, probably the same age as Iffley, but it is quite likely based on the earlier images in the earlier churches, which is a tree of life with Christ in the centre and a river flowing down and sheep beneath it. And so I suddenly sort of realised that actually whereas I thought I'd been just doing something out of my own imagination, that I was actually kind of plugged into a tradition which I didn't even know about.
I was going to say, talk about working in a tradition.
Yes, well, absolutely. And I discovered then that actually this goes back and back and back through the Christian ages.
And Anglicanism, because all the ructions in the church and the controversies that have been in recent decades, do these disturb your allegiance, or has it always been for you Anglicanism is just what you are, and it's natural and unshakable for you?
Well, it's quite true that I was brought up in Anglican tradition, but in fact my sort of church going has been quite sort of checkered in that my family were actually in the 19th century were sort of churchmen in Brighton, but they belonged to very different. There were the Wagners who were evangelical Wagners, and the Anglo-Catholic Wagners who built all the sort of churches in Brighton. So I was quite used to the fact that actually sincere Christians can, and they got on very well together and actually supported each other, and so we had a kind of family history of actually of embracing sort of difference, and not being too disturbed by sort of conflict. And for a time, I went to a church which was a kind of house church. It was, but the person who'd started it had this wonderful kind of mantra that he saw it as that his view of Christianity was that he embraced true Christianity wherever he found it, and that's very much been my kind of approach. That yes, there are always going to be huge conflicts, and one of my heroes is a man called Thomas Traherne. He sort of started here in Oxford, when the Church of England had been abolished, and he actually started as a appointed by sort of Puritans in a place when the Book of Common Prayer was no longer in use, but then came to sort of love the sort of seasons of the sort of church year and the market days of heaven, as he used to call them. And so when the Church of England was re-established, he was very happy to go with it. So these things do sort of sweep over you, and they are disturbing from time to time, but I think they're they're mild compared to the things that have happened in the past.
Yes. Yes.
So one has to take them in one stride.
Yes, I think it's fair to say that in one area at least we have made some progress, which is, 500 years ago we were burning each other as heretics, and now amongst Christian communities there is, I think, much more tolerance and understanding, love, sort of fraternal love for people of who follow a different tradition. I mean, I feel that. I don't know if you feel that.
Yes, no, absolutely. I mean, it was very. One of the people who've been really encouraging to me in my life as an artist was Sister Wendy Beckett, who, and it was lovely sort of taking her to St Mary's in Italy and seeing her sort of response to that, and yes, so I've have sort of Christian friends from all sort of denominations and all backgrounds, and have never felt any sort of difficulty with that or barriers.
I want to turn finally to the question of the modern art scene. You have swum against the tide of contemporary fashion in art, and when I'm confronted by a lot of modern art, I find it empty of meaning somehow, and I wonder what you mentioned a while ago that a lot of people make a lot of money out of modern art, and there is a lot of money which kicks around in the art world. But the art itself, what do you think?
Well, I think what perturbs me more than, there's always been second-rate art going on the whole time, and that's sort of par for the course in a way.
Absolutely.
What perturbs me is actually the abandonment of the traditions of art education, of actually learning to draw, learning to paint. There's no reason why people should stay with that. There's I have no problem with people exploring different kinds of ways of making imaginative things, not using traditional materials or exploring whatever way they can or like. But if you don't sort of learn these sort of basic things, you're missing out on something that has been hugely important throughout the whole of human history, and the fact that art schools have downgraded or even abandoned their sort of drawing and painting is
it true that people in art school these days do not learn to draw?
It's not always true. There are definitely art schools that are very, very good at doing that, but it is also true that there are art schools which have almost sort of persecuted their drawing departments and sort of closed them down, and that is a worry and a sort of sadness, because it's sort of traditions are actually quite sort of fragile. What if you sort of break it? If you don't have people who've learnt to do it, then they can't teach the next generation, so. And I mentioned Sister Wendy a moment ago, and she had this phrase which she talked about one-look art, that she felt that quite a lot of contemporary art was something that was making a very sort of, either it was completely incomprehensible, but that was in a sense what it was trading on, because if you think it's incomprehensible, you may think there's something really deep here which I haven't understood, but that may not be the case. It may just be incomprehensible because there is nothing to comprehend, or it's can be very, it's making a simple political point, which you see it, you've got it, that's it. And I suppose, my interest is in work that actually you can go back to again and again and again, and it can speak to you on different levels and in different ways each time you see it. I have no problem with all kinds of work. And I have no problem actually with political cartoons. I love them, but I also want there to be King Lear. I also want there to be, the Divine Comedy. I want there to be Mozart and Beethoven and things that have this sort of huge sort of richness to the human spirit. And to have those, you have to sort of dig deeper than just sort of the issues of the moment and the sort of politics of the moment. And it's quite rare to find work that does that. There is work that does that, but it's often not valued. And I've mentioned Blake sort of several times now, but one of the things that in the end that he sort of says to artists is because artists who are doing work like that find often that they're not valued in the and it's very difficult to go on. But he says, if no one will employ you, you must employ yourself. And when at the end of the day you put off your sort of shoes and go to bed, you will find put into your shoe a reward such as the world cannot give.
I was listening to a lecture you gave, and you were talking about modernism and the way that modernism is iconoclastic by intent, but that it tends then to this sort of there's a sort of extremism that comes about in it. Every art movement tends towards a more extreme version of itself until it runs out of steam. Is that what I should have understood from what you were saying? Perhaps I misunderstood.
No, I mean, it's one of the interesting. I mean, I'm sort of writing a book at the moment on the nature of art, and I'm talking actually, been sort of looking at iconoclasm through the ages, which is a very sort of fascinating phenomenon, and particularly religious iconoclasm, because it's been it goes right back to ancient Egypt and obviously sort of through to the Reformation, but also into modernism, because a lot of the early modernist artists saw themselves as deliberate iconoclasts, that they were sort of breaking things. And breaking things is not in itself, I mean, it can be, can have a value if if you're doing it not because you want to destroy, but because you actually want to create something that hasn't been possible, or that has been sort of limited and constrained by sort of conventional ways of seeing it. But so it has to have, to be positive, it has to have that, it has to have a vision which is inspiring it. And I think one of the, early 20th century modernism did have a kind of utopian vision. A lot of the abstract painters were very much inspired by new kind of spiritual movements of theosophy and these kind of things, but it's quite difficult to see any sort of vision of that kind in a lot of work of sort of later 20th or to 21st century. So innovation in itself is not enough.
No.
You have to be innovating because you're actually, there's something deep and profound that you want to say, and if you haven't got something deep and profound that you want to say, then that's where you need to begin. What is the, why are we here? What are the most fundamentally important things in human life. And that's why I think that art, if it's going to be of any value, has to be part of a kind of spiritual journey for the artist, which is actually, I find, what makes it really an exciting thing to a journey to go on.
When can we expect this book?
When it's finished.
Well, it sounds like it's going to be the summation of a lifetime, as yours has been, spent in art and producing art. So Roger Wagner, thank you very much indeed for talking to us. It's been fascinating.
Thank you, it's been a great pleasure.